Well, welcome as always to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and on Facebook. I'm Libby Davies, and I'm very glad to be joined as always by my co-host Robin Browne for tonight's Off the Hill political panel. I live on the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish people.
Hi, Libby, and to all our guests and viewers. I'm actually joining you tonight from Mi'kma'ki, aka Halifax, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people.
Well, hello there, Robin. Good that you're joining us tonight. Well, tonight, folks, we're joined for the first time by David Climenhaga. David is a longtime contributor to Rabble and author of Alberta Politics. It's very great to see you on Off the Hill this evening, David. So welcome to you. And we also welcome, okay, great. We also welcome back Rachel Snow. Rachel is Iyahe Nakoda, the daughter of the late Reverend Dr. Chief John Snow. She holds a Juris Doctor from the College of Law, University of Saskatchewan, and is an outspoken educator, speaker, writer, and co-contact person for the Indigenous activist networks. Rachel resides on her ancestral lands in Mini, which is west of Calgary, Alberta. Welcome to you, Rachel. We also welcome back Chuka Ejeckam. Chuka is a writer and policy researcher. His work focuses on inequity and inequality, drug policy, structural racism, and labor. Chuka is also a columnist for rabble.ca, now based in Toronto. Welcome, Chuka. I hope everybody's doing well tonight. And of course, I almost didn't mention, but Karl is always here. Welcome to Karl Nerenberg, Rabble's senior parliamentary correspondent. Hello to you as well, Karl. So welcome to everyone who's registered for this event. As always, please feel free to participate in the chat or ask questions to our panelists throughout the Q&A function. And we always do our best to address questions as they come up. We also tonight have a special book giveaway happening. Thanks to Between the Lines Publishing, we're giving away 10 copies of Peggy Nash's new book, Women Winning Office, an activist guide to getting elected. It's a great book. And so anyone who is registered to watch tonight's event is eligible to win. And we'll be announcing those lucky winners at the end of the panel, just after our question period. So please stay tuned for that. For those of you who are watching on Facebook, welcome to the panel tonight. Well, let's get down to it. It's looking to be a hot, wild summer in the West, not just in regards to the impacts of the climate crisis, but on the political front too. Jason Kenney, as we know, is on the way out, and increasingly nasty conservative leadership race is playing out in Ottawa. And then, of course, we're also seeing violent, hate-filled politics from south of the border. This week, we're going to ask our panelists to connect these issues and explore the challenges and opportunities of the possible scenarios of events currently unfolding. So I'm going to begin with David. David, your coverage and analysis of Alberta politics is really top rate. I love reading all the columns that you do every day, I think it is, on Rabble. So it makes sense to start with you. And I want to get your take on what it means for Albertans and Canadians overall to see the departure of Jason Kenney. Is it really a political shift or new faces, same old game?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because there are elements of all three possibilities that you gave that are true. It's certainly the fact that Mr. Kenney was really pushed out of office by opponents in his own party, more on the right than on the left, indicates that there is a shift going on here, at least a shift within the United Conservative Party. Whether it means a lot in terms of how Alberta will vote in the next election, which is less than a year from now, if we abide by the fixed election date that the UCP put in place when they modified Alison Redford's legislation that had a fixed election period of 3 months. So how significant the change is depends on a whole bunch of factors. I mean, there's a lot of people campaigning to replace Mr. Kenney. Some of them are official candidates now, some of them are not. I thought, when I started thinking about this and I sat down here to get my mind in the right space for this conversation, I thought, well, I'm going to note down all the names on a piece of paper. Well, now the page is full with people that were rumored to be in and are out, or people that are possibly going to be in but haven't actually formally declared themselves yet. So it's hard to say just how significant this is going to be, but my best guess is that we'll see either even a further rightward shift on the part of the UCP, or steady as she goes, much more of the same, but with a milder figurehead at the top. I think the two leading candidates, I'm not bold enough to declare one of them a front runner, but are Brian Jean, the former leader of the Wild Rose Party, and Travis Taves, whose name looks like toes, but it's one of those German names that's pronounced not quite the same as it appears. And Mr. Taves is I think that ideologically he's very close to Kenney, although he claims that he's not a career politician, and actually up to now that would appear to be true. But if he is not a career politician, he's a non-career politician in a position to become one if he becomes the leader of the party.
Yeah, well, just a quick follow-up to that. I think the way you've laid it out, it's similar to what's going on at the national level, where the various candidates some of them are trying to sort of cater to a base, and it's moving the party to a much sharper, harsher right. Others are maybe more sort of looking to a more sort of mainstream kind of conservatism. And I just wonder in Alberta whether your sense of the campaign to oust Kenney that came from so many ridings and riding presidents, and then of course the membership vote, whether that is an indication, whether it was more a dissatisfaction with Kenney personally, or whether it does signal some kind of bigger shift in terms of conservative politics that maybe is going more to the right, and that they saw even Jason Kenney as too mainstream.
Well, there's no question that there was an element in Alberta who saw Jason Kenney as too mainstream, and you'll see on social media real extreme comments about him. He's practically in Trudeau's pocket, statements like that. So there's no question that there was an element in the UCP base that was pushing him that way. But there were also, lingering red Tories and pretty moderate conservatives in the party who are not necessarily unhappy with conservatism or old style conservatism or with other potential candidates, but found Kenney very difficult. He seemed to have a knack to and managed to alienate almost everybody in the province, not just in the party, over the course of 3 years. I have a shrewd colleague who is a good political observer who said 4 years ago that after 3 years in power, he was willing to bet that Mr. Kenney would be the most unpopular person in Alberta, and he called it, right?
Wow.
So,
yeah.
But the style of the Kenney government has been so appalling to many people who I think, including people in his own cabinet, let alone his own caucus, for the kind of highly aggressive social media tactics used by his political advisors, the very personal tone it takes on whenever anyone questions him. Now he will try to stand back and be a little self-righteous about it, but it's very clear that this is a policy. The fights with rural municipalities, for heaven's sakes, who were not getting tax money from oil companies, had essentially been told, well, you don't have to pay them. This is the Tory stronghold, right? That's the conservative home country. So he created conditions and encouraged a kind of discourse that made him very unpopular with a large number of people. So I guess the question now is then, how much will things change? I think if Taves wins, the style of the party will change, but the ideology and the program won't change much. Mm-hmm. I personally, I've met Brian Jean in the past, and he's quite a likable person when you meet him
Mhm.
face to face, as a lot of politicians are. And I think he'll a little more intuitively. Mr. Taves seems much more reserved. I've been close to him, but I haven't really had a conversation with him, right? So, but you know, there's lots of other people running too, and we had a late entry, or not a late entry, but the latest entry today of Leela here, who would be a red Tory and on the Liberal side, such as it is of the UCP, who initially was made deputy leader by Kenny, and then she's been quite open about disagreeing with him. But there, I don't think the strategy. I suspect her strategy is not so much to represent the Liberal side of the UCP as to save her own bacon politically, because in her own riding, she's being pushed out by people loyal to Mr. Kenny. I don't think the party establishment has settled on Travis Taves. And that's why people like Jason Nixon, for example, and possibly like Doug Schweitzer, who has already said he's not only not running for the leadership as a lot of people expected, but he's not even running again. But those red Tory, Schweitzer would be a red Tory type, but he's just out, right? Nixon has been really close to Kenny and again sees the world much the same way, but they obviously have set on Taves as a better bet, as somebody who can win the next election, not only win the leadership race.
Thanks, David.
All right, thanks, David. Moving over to you, Karl, and Libby and David touched on this a bit, but so Jason Kenney was a key cabinet minister in Harper's government. And now, as Libby was mentioning, the Conservative leadership is underway. What impact do you think the Conservative race has had on the Canadian political scene? And for example, do you think it had any impact on the outcome of the Ontario election?
I'll just start the first part of the question first. And this leadership race is arousing a huge amount of interest. It's aroused a lot of interest among the minority of people who sympathized with the trucker convoys and who feel that political correctness and woke culture and giving in to Indigenous people and governments taking away our freedoms are all big problems, and that we should just, pump our resources and we should have open, free, unregulated society, and governments shouldn't tell us to be vaccinated or any of that sort of nonsense. Those people are extremely excited by this. I mean, some of those people had been supporting Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada, and those are an active and vocal group. And Pierre Poilievre has got those people very excited. He's also got people very worried. I mean, I know people who have signed up and paid membership for the Conservative Party who probably would never vote Conservative in a million years, but they want to vote for somebody else than Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre both attracts very ardent supporters and scares a lot of people, and that's got people excited. So the as we know by reading the press, they've sold a huge number of memberships, and there's big disputes among the leaders as to who sold more and who sold which, and they're getting a lot of people motivated and interested. In terms of Ontario, it should have been more related to Ontario in a way, because one of the candidates, Patrick Browne, is a former Ontario Conservative leader. A bunch of the candidates, including Pierre Poilievre and Patrick Browne, live in Ontario. Another candidate, Roman Babber, was a Doug Ford Conservative member of the legislature who Doug Ford kicked out of his government because he refused to get vaccinated. So, but oddly, the Ontario Conservatives just stayed away. They didn't want to talk about this at all. They didn't want to. Doug Ford wanted to campaign actually as Justin Trudeau's best friend and as a kind of manager of things and a builder of issues. I mean, Doug Ford, the one principle, deep-held principle, important political philosophy for him is that he loves cars and people who drive cars, and he's the guy who's going to help people who drive cars. Other than that, he pretty much doesn't believe in anything. He'll change. He started a government against rolling back a hike in the minimum wage. When people complained about it, he just reversed course. He's ready to change his mind and reverse course about pretty much anything, or at least seem to do so. So the leadership race here at the level of the Conservatives will go on, and I think their provincial brethren are going to stay away. But we do have a group. We do have the very large possibility of a candidate who scares the mainstream business community in Canada, the sort of corporate conservative types. Pierre Poilievre, a guy who goes around saying he wants to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada and get involved in Bitcoin, scares the rock-ribbed Bay Street business people. He scares their pants off. There's nothing totally wrong with disagreeing ever with the governor of the Bank of Canada. In way back in the 60s, the Diefenbaker government got rid of James Coyne, who was the governor of the Bank of Canada, but he was really off base with the government policy, and the Chrétien government refused to reappoint John Crow, who represented very tight money and very strict high interest rates. They didn't fire him, they just didn't reappoint him. But Poilievre wants to get rid of the governor of the Bank of Canada just for no reason at all. Nobody can figure out what it is that he's done wrong. He's against institutions. He just like he used to attack the chief electoral officer, and his kind of like bull in the china shop attitude. I tell you, that's why a guy who was making more money in half a day than he'll make in a month as prime minister was ready to give it up to be prime minister, because that's Jean Charest, by the way. Jean Charest doesn't need this. He needs this like a hole in the head. He's had a long political career, and he's enormously successful as a corporate lawyer. But they came to him on hands and knees, and they said, "You gotta run. You gotta stop this guy." The business people of Canada. This is a conservative leadership candidate who scares the corporate community that has supported the Conservative Party for 50 years.
Carl, you'll recall that Mr. Kenney and Mr. Ford used to say that they could finish each other's sentences, but they're not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
No, definitely not.
Thanks, Carl. Libby?
Yeah. Well, I guess I want to sort of shift the conversation a little bit, because I think what we're trying to get at here is watching these conservative leadership races go on federally and now in Alberta, plus the Ontario election, plus what's happening south of the border, where the politics is just so vitriolic and violent and hateful. I think what's really of interest to us and concerning us is how these issues are impacting Canadian politics and Canadian society. And I think the most disturbing development we're seeing in the Conservative leadership race is the rise of intolerance and hateful rhetoric from not all the candidates, but many of the candidates. And so, Rachel, to you, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. What impact do these emerging and strengthening, it appears, political right-wing forces have on Indigenous justice and land defense that really has grown remarkably, and yet here you are up against a pretty powerful movement also happening on the right. So what's the impact of this on justice and land defense?
Well, I think especially in Alberta, where we've already seen a bill put forward by Kenney's government right at the beginning of COVID, when we had people that were Indigenous people, First Nation people, who were actually sitting or standing in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en and with their stand in trying to protect the land. And I think that Alberta has been very smart about getting the First Nations, especially in the northern areas. They've all sort of got them feeding into the corporate plan for Canada. So I don't think that we'd see a lot of think that we'd see a lot of protests there anyways. But there's other things happening, such as the proposed mining and the things they want to do around the mountain areas, more privatizing of the parks and looking at the lakes and what they're doing to try to turn some of our sacred areas and our areas that are still unceded or not settled through a specific or a comprehensive lands claim process. Those types of things, I think, is where you might still see some action, despite the bill that came out public safety bill or whatever Kenny put forward. I mean, he didn't even exercise it against, when he had a convoy at the border. That was the time for him to put in his Emergency Measures Act or whatever it was he was doing, but he didn't do that. So I think that you're still going to see some pushback if the grassroots people are getting the proper information. And that, again, that's up to sort of the organizations where I work and where I'm writing with Rabble, and where I'm trying to work with Russ Dybo and with the Indigenous Activist Network. It's our job, or it's our responsibility, to try to break down some of the policies, legislation, the things that are happening within Canadian politics, within Alberta politics, how that affects legislation, and then further how that affects our First Nation people, the grassroots people on the ground. And if you, again, I've explained this a few times, saying that what Canadian mainstream media or Canadian media likes to look at is they like to ask the chief and council, feeling that these are the duly elected representatives of a community. And I've repeatedly said, in our demographics, in our areas, in our reserves where we vote, we don't have platforms. You have clans and families voting. So you can have the same leadership spanning over a period of longer than 5-10 years. And if that's the case, then is this person really qualified to look at what's happening nationally, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, and see the big picture and fight that fight? So it's still, for us, I think, at the grassroots level, it's still work. I mean, we have to continue to fight some of the the only thing I keep thinking in my head is this cancel culture business that Kenny said when after we found the unmarked graves in Kamloops, he had come across, because we had there was then a demand to rename buildings in Calgary, and statues were being torn down. But at the same time, he was saying it was cancel culture, and yet there aren't any monuments or anything that are up that show our contributions. So if there were things like that, then yes, I think it would be, he can make a cancel culture argument, but he pretty well, Canadian society, Alberta society, or Alberta people have canceled First Nations. And when you do that and obliterate them and have them have their perspective or their voices not being heard historically or in mainstream events, I think, you've pretty well canceled their perspective or their opinion already. So then if it's only one perspective, then yes, we are going to make strong statements and, do those, I don't know, in Kenny or some of the right-wing conservatives' mind, I guess it's terrorism, acts of terrorism, but we look at it from our perspective as acts of protectionism and some of the things that we were told that we needed to do in order to keep our place and respect the land and help continue the way of life, not only for us, but what modern scientists, other people are finding now is living in harmony, living in balance. That is actually a better way so that we can have life for all of us.
Yeah. Well, I one of the things I take from that, Rachel, is the need to focus attention on greater solidarity, alliances, because there is this, growing strength of the right that we can see evident in the United States, but also here in Canada. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Robin, because I think that's a very good segue over to bringing Chuka into the conversation about how this is all playing out.
Yeah, it is. But before I get to that, let me just make a comment about this idea of cancel culture, right? Because that brings up this whole idea of the term thought police, right? Which suggests that the left somehow has police that run around. Let's remember, the right have police, right? Even the people on the right don't say the left have police. They say the left control the media and stuff. But so let's just remember that, right? So Chuka, over to you on this one. But we'd like to hear from everybody on it. Given the rise of the right and violent attacks in the U.S. and the apparent growing strength of right-wing politics in Canada, Should activists focus their attention on combating the right wing or ignore it and focus on the solutions to the many other pressing problems we face? So we'll start with Chuka, but let's hear from everybody on that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, well, it wouldn't, I can't rightly say what activists should do, but I certainly don't think that the issues can be separated. And I can explain why. Just to refer back to what you were discussing a moment ago, Libby, about the impact of US politics on what's happening in Canadian politics now. I think that there are a couple things that that can be identified as potentially sort of spilling between the two. In one of the leadership, in one of the debates for the Federal Conservative Party leadership, only Leslyn Lewis on stage. Leslyn Lewis was the only candidate who advocated against abortion access, or stated that she was against people accessing abortion, or personally against it, what have you. And it got significant applause from the crowd. And of course, we're seeing a horrifically revanchist attack on the rights of women and other people, and people who can become pregnant in the US. And, I think there's concern that that's emboldening people on the right in Canada. Similarly, just earlier today, I saw a headline about, I haven't dug into this yet, but there was legislation passed regarding the Dakota Access Pipeline that asserts that any sort of attempt to interfere with its development or operation is now considered, under this legislation, would be considered terrorism, and anyone charged with that is susceptible to potentially 10 years incarcerated. So, I mean, I don't think that, separating take, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline. That is, of course, an issue of environmentalism, but of course, it's also an issue of entrenched poverty. Poverty is also an issue of racism. So I think that the way that these issues are connected means that you can, in addressing one, you sort of have to fundamentally address another. An example, I think, a significant example of this is the Black Panthers breakfast survival programs. The programs were, they spanned a number of sectors, right? There were, there was free medical, there was services and resources, there was education, there was breakfast run for the community. All of these things are, one is dealing with medical inequity, one is sort of dealing with educational inequity, but all of them, of course, are also measures of anti-racism, in that they're addressing inequities that are disproportionately borne by particular communities. So I think that if you are sort of seeking to address or eliminate inequity in housing, in economic security, and access to any number of institutions or services, then the people who are disproportionately prohibited from that access are always going to be racialized populations and marginalized groups. And so in attempting to address those issues, those pressing issues that you mentioned, Robin, I think you are necessarily also opposing the right. But I do think that, I don't know, this is a point we can return to, but I think as well, though, that there will come a time in the near future where we'll have to start simply just like building the world that we want to see, and providing the lives for people that we want, that lives that are sort of free from the violence that is increasingly being advocated and enacted by the right, but also free from the violence that is entrenched in the society that we all inhabit.
Sorry, yeah, thank you, Chuka. Let's go to David on that. So David, the question again is, should activists be focusing on combating the right, or focusing on solutions to the many other problems we face?
Well, you can do both. And what I was going to say is, the elephant in the room here is that left-wing parties, or parties that are identified as left-wing parties, aren't really acting like left-wing parties anymore. And maybe it's time to go back to that model. And what do left-wing parties do? They represent working people. And it doesn't matter what race or religion or what gender they are. It matters that they're working people, and that they have rights that need to be enforced in the workplace. And all of our political parties, certainly this is true in Alberta, they all accept the assumptions of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is not working for working people. And when they see no solutions offered on the left, they are still looking for solutions. And unscrupulous people on the far right are saying, we've got a solution, and they're going to it. So we can combat the right-wing extremism by having our left-wing parties act more like workers' parties. That's the gospel of Dave.
Actually, just before we hear from Karl and Rachel on this, I want to just throw something else into the mix, because we're talking about how to deal with the right wing, how to deal with the right wing, or as opposed to dealing with the pressing issues. But there's also the question of how to deal with the response that we're seeing by governments to the right wing, i.e., there's a big focus on hate crimes, right? And part of what we're seeing there is that's turning into increase in police budget, right? And actually, in the case of, I know some research was done by activist L. Jones in Hamilton. So the increase in police budgets focusing on hate crimes, but they're actually not doing much on hate crimes. They're kind of going out and they're going after activists holding up this is in Hamilton, holding up the anarchy sign of the right. So as I'm throwing that into the mix also, let's go over to Karl in terms of Karl, given all this, how should we respond given the rise of the right and hate crimes and focus on hate crimes and hate versus dealing with the issues of the day?
I want to specifically address my answer to the American member of our audience who asked us to comment from the point of view of the Americans, because I think in the States, and I know lots of people in the States and I have family in the States, the feeling of sort of people of goodwill, especially relatively affluent, middle class, educated, white people of goodwill is, oh, the Democratic Party has gotten too radical, has gotten too concerned with the special interests and minority groups. It has moved too far. It has been too influenced by the Bernie Sanders group, and that's why the right is winning the day. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. What the American solution is the antidote to right-wing faux populism, right-wing phony baloney rhetorical populism, which seeks to create scapegoats and innocent victims and turn people's resentment about their weak economic situation, their poor economic prospects against members of minority groups, against black people, against gay people, against women, that the solution to that is not to waste your time playing tennis in their court, but is to have actual, serious, radical economic solutions that empower working people, that create a far greater economic opportunity locally, that maybe even get the state back involved in owning and running and working together with private sector in the productive side of the economy, which we should also do in Canada. And I mean, there were lots of good ideas of that sort in legislation that Joe Biden tried to get passed, but he couldn't. And I don't actually have a solution as to how you can have that kind of... I do think that had Biden managed to pass the legislative program he put to Congress, much of it drafted by Bernie Sanders and his gang, I'll admit, had he managed to pass it, he'd be far more popular now, and it'd be far more. The country would be looking very different, and the power of the reactive right would be far less. So the problem is, in terms of the actual American situation, is having the Democrats having 50 seats in the Senate and having at least two of the senators, very conservative senators, aren't going to go along with any of this, is significant. And how to finesse that, I don't have the solution to that. I mean, they were smart enough to realize that to legislatively finesse the need for 60 votes in the Congress getting it passed, they could use this so-called reconciliation budgetary device, where if a legislative measure is a budget, then you can simply pass it in one house and pass it with a 50% majority in the other. But they still couldn't get stuff passed that they thought they could. I think an American president who proposed that, if Bernie Sanders were president, he'd be out getting people excited about these things rather than sitting around mumbling and looking at his socks, as Joe Biden tends to do. So at the very least, you have to get out there and get people hugely interested and involved, and you have to get the people to shake. And maybe if you went into West Virginia and talked to the working people and you really had them shake Joe Manchin's cage, you might get him to change his vote and some of that stuff. but you sort of have a president who was kind of reluctantly and kind of being pushed into propose a radical agenda, and then running into more conservative elements in his own party that were stopping him. So that's all in American politics, but the simple answer is exactly David's answer, which is essentially don't fight on the playing field defined by the right. You have to have an aggressive, confident, assertive agenda on the left. And I think in Canada as well, part of that includes very active public sector participation in the economy, not merely in the welfare state, not merely in taxing the so-called productive economy to help people with social benefits, which we should do, and we should expand healthcare to include pharmaceuticals and include dental care. But you should start owning things and start making things as well, as we once thought was a good idea.
Just jump in because it's very interesting hearing all of you speak about all of these fairly major forces going on, whether it's Alberta, in Ottawa, in the US, and we could even throw into the mix now, the Ontario NDP and the fact that Andrea Horwath is stepping down. So there's going to be sort of a whole opportunity there in terms of potential changes. But it feels that at the very best, politics is so much in flux. Like all the old rules, the old game is pretty well gone, right? We, on the one hand, one can say we see the rise of the right and how much influence and impact does that have, but we can also see that there are elements of strengthening left and progressive movements, activism, as well as representatives, both in the US and here in Canada. So I just to bring Chuka and Rachel back in, I do think the question partly becomes, is there a space here? Is there an opportunity to help redefine what politics is about, right? The die is not cast. Is there an opportunity for alliances and coalitions and movements and social activists to try and redefine what the political space, campaign, parties are all about? Any thoughts on that?
You want to go first, Rachel?
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, like, and I forget to say that I'm not speaking for all Indigenous people. Really, I'm focusing on the First Nation people, the Native Americans across the line. I also have American relatives because my late mom was a Native American, full-blooded from Yuma, Arizona. She was Quechan. So I have relatives south of the border too who, and it's funny because when I hear the talk about the right and the left and the regional, state, or whatever national politics that are happening, we're, as First Nations or Native Americans, we feel like we're dealing with the same short end of the stick. We feel like I think there's, if you look right now across Canada and you see the high percentages of First Nations who live in on reserve, who are unemployed and living in poverty, and very similar statistics in the United States as well, trying to have that, more of a say or a coalition or doing things to get people involved, it becomes very difficult because they're busy surviving. If people can't are only making it paycheck to paycheck and not even doing that, are afraid to lose their houses, living in their cars, whatever's happening in sort of mainstream, you have to look at that and take it down about 10 notches to what's happening in a First Nation community, on a reserve or on a reservation. And so when we're talking about that, I always say, like, how can we begin the discussion? How can we have the discussion unless we have an actual picture of what is really happening in our First Nation communities? And I've said this before, that's why I stay on my reserve. I stay here, I hunt around for gas money, head gasket broke, so I can't get off the reserve. Things like that are very common for First Nation people. And if we're at that sort of capacity, I don't know how much we can contribute to looking at sort of the bigger picture, or the things kind of, I feel like this, that things that are being thrown at us that, we're we're the inferior races, where, obviously color has separated us, and whether or not that's a ball in the right wing court, I think that ball has existed there for a long time. I think what Chuka said too is that the system is inherent into the system, and there's this idea of adversarial right and wrong, good and bad, left and right. And when we hear this, when I hear this, I think well, if you involve the people and you have, the strong ties of spirituality and the strong guidance that you're to live in harmony with the land and nature and not take more than you need, that's sort of opposite, or a paradox, or not quite what capitalism tells us. And basically, we're talking about capitalist structures that still exist. So I think that I like these discussions. I like hearing what is kind of in the minds of people. But again, I always have to bring in my own reality, bring in what is happening with the First Nation people. And we are the targets of this far right. And we are the targets, that are being hit, baton, shot, incarcerated. We're the targets. But yet we're busy surviving, and we're not even part of the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And Chuka,
actually,
any further comments?
Yeah,
Well,
I just thought.
Oh, go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll be pretty quick. I just wanted to say that sort of what you were speaking about, Rachel, people being their sort of the demands of their life or the circumstances of their life, sort of keeping them from participating in more sort of fanciful notions of like what sort of society we'd like to build and whatnot. It's circumstances like that make me think that the survival program strategy that the Black Panthers employed is so compelling, in that this was like a Maoist revolutionary organization, but they were also just like feeding kids breakfast and helping people get medical care, and all of that they were like creating the world that they wanted simply by just asserting its existence. So I think that is really interesting. In terms of politics being in flux, I think that it certainly is, and I think people are being disillusioned in ways that are both dangerous and potentially useful or potentially valuable. Obviously, the horror that happened in Uvalde, Texas, there's continued reports of the absolute incompetence and seeming vindictive treatment of the parents by the police at seemingly like every level of the police in that specific jurisdiction. Now the police officers are refusing to cooperate with federal investigators. And I think that sort of disillusionment with the structures that were conditioned to abide by is potentially useful in sort of helping people conceive of a world that doesn't have these things that they've always just assumed would exist, like police, for example. And this is a bit out there, but I think as well the fact that most countries in the global South are not paying any attention to America's very sort of grand statements about what's happening in the Ukraine and things like that. I think it's anything that indicates the waning influence of the West is something to celebrate.
Yep. Okay, I think what we're going to do is move on to some questions from folks who are watching online. It's been a great discussion so far, very far-ranging, sort of going from the macro big picture down to very specifics. And in fact, this first question that we have is bringing us back to a very specific element of what we've been speaking about. And that is the question from Kathleen is, if Poilievre wins the CPC leadership, what does that mean for Canada's political landscape? I mean, Karl, maybe we'll start with you, and then if anybody else would like to jump in on that one.
Poilievre is not to be underestimated. He is, in fact, in many ways, a more clever politician than Harper, because he actually, at a personal level, is better at connecting with people. Harper had a very, very automaton manner, and he never could. He was sort of symbolized by journalists photographing him, wishing his kids a good day at school and shaking their hands. And Polyev, he has an attractive wife, originally Latin American, and he has an easier, more comfortable, rhetorical manner. And we've seen south of the border, and we're seeing in a country like Colombia now, that kind of kooky populism with borderline crackpot, but very, very flashy ideas appeals to people. People somehow, in an age of sound bites and of instant social media posts and TikTok. I mean, in our neighbor in Latin America, Colombia, a potential next president conducts his entire campaign on TikTok. He's a 77-year-old sort of Trumpish style billionaire. And Polyev is really a past master of working social media, and then complementing that with very rousing rallies. One of the favorite battle cries, which really works with his crowd, is defund the CBC. And he's not going to come to defund Rabble. He hasn't heard about us. So I think he's not to be underestimated. I think it's false to assume that if the Conservatives choose what we would think to be the most right-wing leader, that he's the most easy to defeat. The overwhelming majority of voters don't have any concept of right and left, and don't classify themselves as either right or left, or certainly a very, maybe not the majority, but a very significant part of the potential voters out there. And Polyev goes around that other clever right-wing populist technique, attacking corporations, claiming that the government is all in the pocket of corporations, like for the big pharma, and enforcing vaccines on us, and seeming to be the rebel populist little guy candidate, which he does very cleverly for a person of not much accomplishment before he became a professional politician at the age of 5 or 6, it seems, barely out of diapers, and then he was a member of parliament. A little exaggeration there. So I would say, yes, it was a very dangerous moment for Canadian politics to have a right-wing, a clever, capable, quick on his feet, right-wing demagogue as leader of one of our major national parties. And it would be a scary prospect, and I don't know what the best solution for countering him is. One might be a Liberal NDP Green electoral pact. I mean, the NDP and the Liberals are already in a pact to govern, and just to make sure that there's no chance. I think the best thing they can do, the smartest thing the Liberals would do now, electoral reform. Any other system than first past the post, a candidate like Polyev, who could never get more than the maximum 40% of the vote, he'd never get a majority of seats. Any other system, a ranked ballot, the system, the single transferable vote they tried in BC, or some form of mixed proportional system, there is no system except this system that would give Polyev a crack at a majority government or even at power. So the smartest thing to do now, reform our electoral system to make sure that we don't get extreme candidates slipping in with a majority of seats without a majority of the vote.
Oh, I can't. I think you went on mute for a while, but anyway, a great observation about electoral reform. Of course, the Liberals have always opposed it because it was never in their interest to have electoral reform. But who knows? Maybe suddenly they'll see the writing on the wall and realize it is in their interest to have electoral reform. Just before we move on to the next question with Robin, anybody else, David, Rachel, or Chuka, want to jump in on this Polyev impact if he wins? Any thoughts?
Well, I did have a couple of things I wanted to say, and I'll try to be quick. One is that I don't think his candidacy will make much difference in Alberta, because federally Alberta seems to vote. It's weird because Edmonton, for example, votes pretty consistently NDP provincially, but federally they're going to vote. They're going to support the Conservative candidate, whoever that is. So electoral behavior is not likely to be much changed. Oh, I do think there is kind of a neoliberal elite consensus in the country now, and that includes the Conservatives. But it's very clever of Mr. Polyev to appear to run against that. Perhaps we could find somebody on the left who could really run against it.
Did anybody else want to jump in on that? Nope. All right. Is Doug Ford winning a second, even bigger majority in Ontario with the lowest voter turnout in Ontario's history, including the NDP failing to get the vote out? Is this a cautionary tale for Alberta and the country?
I mean, it seems to me just like a cautionary tale writ large for all quote unquote liberal democracies. But I mean, you know, in the year 2022, is anything not a cautionary tale? I think like falling voter turnout, this sort of again increasing alienation with the political system, increasingly entrenched belief that ultimately nothing good will ever happen, or the things that need to happen won't. I think that I myself can say that there are times when I'm transfixed with horror at the potential futures that we face, and some of the most inequitable ones. And so I think that there is like I mean, we've talked about this before, but it's much more difficult to tell a coherent political story from the left than it is from the right, because from the right, you just like never have to consider history or context or anything really. Whereas all of that, it factors into analysis, that material analysis. So I think it is, if it is, you know, if there was a really high turnout and more ridings won by parties that at very least speak about climate change, speak about global inequities, speak about international COVID-19 vaccine access, then that, you know, one could point to that and say, well, there's this increasing, a growing voting bloc of young people that are increasingly distressed by these issues and are motivated in elections. The fact that we saw the lowest turnout and a majority for Doug Ford again, despite that he, you know, despite failing to prevent preventable deaths in the thousands, despite I went out on my snowmobile, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that it garners hope, but I don't think that it should be taken as a symbol of defeat or as a reason to surrender. Obviously, I think righteous indignation is perhaps one of our most valuable resources, but I don't think it's a good thing that it happened.
The question was asked, is this a cautionary tale for Alberta? And of course it is, in the sense that the Conservatives, whoever their leader is going to try to suppress the vote to create the conditions that happened in Ontario. But I would say to you, my prediction is the vote turnout will be pretty high in the next election. It's less than a year, as we were saying at the start, until the next election in Alberta, if they call it when they say they're going to call it. And that will be probably not enough time to completely settle the electorate down. There were people on both sides of the political spectrum were really mad at Mr. Kenney, and I think that level of engagement will likely continue here.
Okay. We just got another question that's come in, focusing on what a number of you said, which is what space is there for grassroots movements to redefine or change the way politics is done, to influence political parties. So the question that's come in is, how do grassroots movement get the attention of the party establishment in order to get them to speak more from the left? Now, I presume this would be particularly in order in terms of what we can expect to see coming in an Ontario leadership race, but certainly at the federal level too for the NDP and even at provincial level. So anybody want to take that question on? How do we get the attention of the NDP?
And you have to be really fast because we're wrapping up a bit early because we want to announce the winners of our book giveaway.
Right. Okay. Quick comment. Thanks, Robin.
The lightning round.
Okay, well, we know how the right did it in Alberta. They fomented a rebellion against the leaders. So,
one thing is you have to take your battle to the streets. Again, oddly, more recently, the right has been more active at that than the left, which once had to be more active. But you have to get people out again. You have to get people visible.
I mean, this is obviously very fanciful, but I think it has to be like a massive work stoppage. It has to be, we have to assert that like we will not continue with this nonsense until a world in which we refuse to sacrifice any life or any region is developed, because this shit cannot go on.
Thanks, Chuka.
And Rachel, any last thoughts?
Just that's just a Monday for me, or we do that all the time anyways. And if we have to do that, we're not going to stop, but it would be nice for people to get revved up about the climate and other things, and to see people more or less stepping up, because we just can't do this by ourselves, and it matters again for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So that's all the time we have for questions today. Thanks to our audience members for their interventions. As everyone who's tuning in should know, your registration for this month's panel made you eligible to win Peggy Nash's new book, Women Winning Office, an activist guide to getting elected. Thanks to Between the Lines Publishing, we're giving away 10 copies of the book, and the lucky winners are, I have my little drummer here, are Lauren, Brenda, Barbara, Jim, Eric, Christine, Christopher, Corey, Mikhail, and Shirley. So congratulations. Rabble will be in touch with you via email over the next few days to contact you about receiving your book. And thank you to everyone who registered for tonight's panel. Thanks also to all our panelists, Rachel Snow, David Climenhaga, Chuka Ejeckam, and Karl Nerenberg. And of course, thank you to my wonderful co-host, Libby Davies. This is our last planned Off the Hill for the summer, but we will be back, and Rabble's political news and analysis is ongoing on the website. Make sure you get an invitation to our next Off the Hill. Be sure to sign up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/alerts. And finally, thank you to Rabble for creating this space to host these important discussions. And we encourage you to help Rabble out by becoming a monthly donor at rabble.ca/donate. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a happy and safe summer. Good night.
Thanks, Robin. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.